She didn't speak until the dog returned. For 12 days she was missing. And when Lyra Monroe was finally found, barefoot, cold, clutching a torn bracelet, she didn't say a word. Not to her mother, not to the police, not even to herself. But there was a dog beside her, not barking, just watching, like he had kept vigil the entire time. They tried to take the dog away. He had no collar, no owner, but Lyra screamed the moment they touched him, so they let him stay. And slowly, she began to speak, only to him. This is the story of Echo, a German shepherd with no past, who carried the pieces of a broken girl's future in the quiet beat of his paws. And it's also the story of what he ran from, and what he refused to forget. The town of Maple Glen was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and waved at passing tractors like old friends. Tucked between quilted meadows and whispering woods, it moved at the pace of porch swings and fading sunsets. The streets curved gently, as if designed not for speed but for long walks and small talk. And if you stood still long enough, you could hear the creak of a wind chime, the buzz of summer flies, or the lazy thud of ripe apples dropping onto soft earth. On that particular afternoon, the sky was the color of a lullaby, not quite blue, not yet dusk, and the breeze came in warm, smelling faintly of lilacs and soil. It was the kind of day that felt too gentle to ever end in grief. In the backyard of a pale yellow farmhouse, a little girl named Lyra Monroe, age 6, darted between patches of tall grass, giggling as she tried to stay hidden behind the old maple trees. Her sundress, soft pink with embroidered daisies, billowed behind her like a cape. She had tied her long brown hair into 2 uneven pigtails that bounced with every step. In one hand she held a threadbare stuffed rabbit named Button. The other hand waved clumsily as she called out to her cat. "Oliver, you're supposed to find me," she squealed, her voice trailing into the branches. From a safe distance, a gray tabby with wise yellow eyes crouched low in the shade of the porch steps, tail flicking. Oliver had no interest in games of hide-and-seek, but tolerated them with the kind of resigned loyalty only cats could muster. Inside the house, Grace Monroe stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, humming an old Simon and Garfunkel tune that had somehow survived years of motherhood and static-filled radios. The window in front of her was cracked open, and through it she could hear the echoes of her daughter's laughter dancing with the wind. She smiled without looking up, hands submerged in warm, soapy water as she scrubbed a chipped plate. She didn't know it, but this would be the last time she'd hum without her voice breaking. Grace glanced up just in time to see a flicker of pink disappear behind the garden shed. Her heart tugged in that familiar, tender way mothers know too well. That quiet cocktail of pride, fear, and the ache of watching childhood unfold. 10 more minutes, then dinner," she called through the screen. No answer. Just the soft rustle of leaves. Grace wasn't worried. Not yet. In the backyard, Lyra crouched behind a bush, whispering to Button. "If we stay really still, he won't find us," she said seriously, pointing at Oliver, who was still feigning ignorance. "And then we win." She held up her wrist, adjusting the handmade bracelet she and her mom had made together, beads of pastel blue and yellow strung together with elastic and a heart-shaped charm in the center. "It was her lucky finder bracelet," she said. She never took it off. A gentle gust of wind rustled the branches above her, and a few leaves floated down like confetti. Lyra looked up at the sky, blinking as sunlight painted golden stripes across her cheeks. Then something caught her attention. The edge of the woods shimmered in the afternoon light. The trees swayed lazily, revealing glimpses of something movement maybe, or just the way light tricked the eyes. Lyra tilted her head. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Button, though of course Button didn't answer. She took a small step forward, then another, the grass brushing against her shins. Her feet made no sound. Back in the kitchen, Grace wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at the clock. 5:30. She reached for the kettle to start tea, still humming, still unbothered. Outside, Lyra had wandered closer to the tree line. Not far. Just a few steps. She was still in sight, technically. Still in the yard. Still close enough that, in a different timeline, her mother could have stepped out and said, "That's far enough, sweetheart." And Lyra would have turned back. But Grace didn't step out. And the wind carried no warnings. Only the rustle of trees. The hush of leaves. Then, a snap. A soft shuffle. A shadow that didn't belong. Oliver's ears perked. The cat stood suddenly, fur rising, eyes fixed toward the woods. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound Grace had never heard from him before. But Grace wasn't there to hear it. She was still inside, pouring water over a tea bag, still humming, still living in the last few seconds of before. The steam from Grace's tea curled into the air like a question that had no answer. She brought the cup to her lips, took a careful sip, and glanced out the window again. The yard was still. The wind had quieted, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, but hollow. She stepped out onto the back porch, still holding the mug, her eyes scanning the garden. "Lyra?" she called lightly. No answer. She tried again, louder this time. "Sweetheart, it's time to come in. Dinner's ready." Nothing but the rustle of branches, the kind of silence that makes your skin tighten, like the world is holding its breath. Grace set the mug down on the porch railing and walked into the yard, shielding her eyes against the falling light. She called again, circling around the shed where she'd last seen that flash of pink. But there was no giggle, no shuffle, no tiny voice saying, "I'm hiding," only stillness. "Lyra, this isn't funny. Come out, baby. Please." She moved faster now, pushing aside bushes, peeking behind trees, crouching to look under the deck. The cat, Oliver, stood frozen near the tree line, tail stiff, eyes fixed on something unseen. Grace's voice cracked as she called out once more, "Lyra!" Nothing. Her breath shortened. The tips of her fingers began to tingle. It was like the ground had fallen out from under her. She dropped to her knees and shouted her daughter's name again, louder, the sound cracking through the still air. And then she ran. Within 30 minutes, half the town of Maple Glen was combing through yards and sheds, calling out Lyra's name like it was a prayer trying to reach heaven through the trees. Flashlights were pulled from drawers. Farmers left dinner plates untouched on tables. Deputies arrived and started coordinating grids, drawing rough maps with shaking fingers and wide eyes. Neighbors fanned out toward the woods with dogs, whistles, and lanterns. The sun had dipped lower now, bruising the sky with orange and violet. The woods, once playful and sun-dappled, had turned cold in its silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. Grace stood in the center of it all, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist like she was trying to hold her body together. Her eyes were red. Her knees were stained with dirt from where she'd fallen. She held Lyra's stuffed rabbit, Button, against her chest, like it could somehow anchor her to a version of reality where this wasn't happening. Deputy Marcus Hughes, a man with 30 years of service and lines etched deep around his eyes, approached carefully. "We'll find her," he said gently, though his voice didn't carry the confidence it once had. "She was just right there," Grace whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "She never goes into the woods. She never wanders." Hughes nodded solemnly, then turned to his radio. Search teams continue sector sweep Alpha through Charlie. Use caution. No sign yet, but we're working against the clock. As night crept in, the forest began to shift. Shadows lengthened. Sounds became more distorted. And yet, it was the silence that weighed the heaviest. There was no cry for help, no crunch of leaves under hurried footsteps. Just the sound of wind pressing through branches, and the rhythmic hum of people calling Lyra's name over and over, voices growing thinner, more desperate with every passing minute. Grace's sister, Marin, arrived shortly after sunset and wrapped her arms around her. The hug was fierce, silent, and full of the kind of fear that didn't need words. Grace didn't speak. She couldn't. Her lips moved, but nothing came out, like the scream inside her had gone too deep to rise. By midnight, news trucks lined the gravel road near the Monroe house. Drones flew overhead. Reporters whispered names into cameras, and anchors used phrases like "small town gripped by tragedy" and "the clock is ticking." But to Grace, it all sounded like static. All she wanted was her little girl running barefoot through the grass again. Just one more giggle, one more "Mama" from behind the garden shed. Deputy Hughes gathered the volunteers in a circle, holding a flashlight under his chin like a makeshift lantern. "She couldn't have gone far on foot, not with the sun still up when she vanished," he said. "We've marked the outer perimeters. Dogs are on standby. We'll start daylight tracking at 0500. Keep your radios on and stay safe. Whoever took her, if anyone did, left no sign." That was what terrified them the most. There were no signs, no struggle, no broken branches, no footprints leading away. It was like the girl had been swallowed whole by the forest itself. The first drops fell like whispers light, tentative, almost gentle. But within minutes, the sky opened with a sound like grief being torn from the clouds. Rain fell hard and fast, slicing through the forest canopy, hammering rooftops, and soaking through the jackets and resolve of every searcher still out in the woods. Deputy Hughes pressed the radio to his mouth under the hood of his slicker. "Pull everyone in. Visibility's shot. It's not safe out there." Lightning cracked across the sky, exposing twisted limbs of trees like bone through torn flesh. Thunder rolled close behind, shaking windows, rattling hearts. Grace stood at the edge of her porch, unmoving. Her long cardigan clung to her skin, soaked straight through, hair plastered to her cheeks. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't flinch as thunder cracked again overhead. She stared into the woods, into the place that had taken her child. Behind her, neighbors and searchers trickled back, clothes heavy with rain, boots caked in mud. Some kept their heads down, others cast her sympathetic glances. No one had the heart to speak. No one had found anything. A bracelet, a footprint, a torn shoe. Nothing. "Mrs. Monroe," Deputy Hughes called softly as he stepped onto the porch, water dripping from his hat brim. "Please, you need to come inside, get warm." She didn't answer. Her lips moved, but the sound was too low to hear at first. Hughes took a step closer. "Grace?" She turned her face slightly, and he saw her eyes red, swollen, distant. "She's not gone," she whispered. "I'd feel it. I'd know." The rain kept falling. Harder now. Wind pushed against them like invisible hands trying to drive them back inside. "She's not gone," Grace said again, louder this time. "I don't care what anyone says. She's out there. I can feel her." Deputy Hughes exhaled slowly and nodded. "We're not giving up. We're regrouping for the night, but we'll be back out at first light. With dogs, drones, everything we've got." Grace didn't move. The storm raged around her, but she stayed rooted to the spot, like the oak trees in the yard. Old, defiant, unwilling to bow even when the sky collapsed. From across the street, Marin watched from the living room window of Grace's house, clutching a towel to her chest. The lights inside flickered under the strain of the storm. She turned back to the kettle on the stove, hands shaking slightly as she poured tea into 2 mugs, though she knew Grace wouldn't drink it. "She hasn't come in for hours," Marin murmured to no one. Back outside, the last of the volunteers climbed into muddy pickups, headlights cutting through sheets of rain as they pulled away one by one. Only the deputies remained, guarding the house in quiet formation, their cars parked with red and blue lights pulsing faintly through the mist. And still Grace stood. The wind whipped the hem of her cardigan. Her teeth began to chatter, but her arms remained limp at her sides. She was staring past the trees now, eyes unfocused, as if trying to see not with sight but with something deeper, something primal. A thread stretched between mother and child, pulled taut by distance but unbroken. Suddenly, the cat Oliver bolted from the porch and darted into the yard. He stopped just before the tree line, ears perked, soaked through but unmoving. He stared into the forest like he'd heard something no one else could. Grace turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" she said. Hughes paused. "Hear what?" She took a few steps forward, rain streaming down her face. "There was something like a bell or a chime." "There's nothing out there, Grace, not tonight. Let's get you inside." She shook her head. "No, please, just a few more minutes." A long silence passed between them, the kind of silence filled with everything that couldn't be said. Hughes looked at her, this mother soaked and shivering, and felt the familiar sting in his eyes that he hadn't felt since his own daughter left for college. "All right," he said finally, and stepped back. "But just 5. Grace nodded once. Her lips were blue, her skin cold, but she turned back toward the woods and whispered again, soft, pleading, "Lyra, baby, if you can hear me, I'm right here. I never stopped looking. I'll never stop." The wind seemed to quiet for a beat, the kind of hush that made you believe maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. And in that pause, in the crackling silence between thunderclaps, the air carried something almost too faint to name. Not a voice, not a word, but a presence. She wasn't alone. She just didn't know it yet. It had been 3 days. 3 days since the woods swallowed Lyra whole. 3 days of rain, silence, and prayers said with cracked lips and shaking hands. 3 days since Grace Monroe had last heard the sound of her daughter's laughter echo through the kitchen window. The town of Maple Glen had begun to wilt under the weight of dread. Flyers curled at the edges from damp air, clinging to telephone poles like unanswered questions. The search had grown quieter, not ended but quieter. The kind of silence people adopt when they've started preparing for the worst but haven't found the courage to say it out loud. Grace hadn't left the house. She barely left the porch. She slept, if it could be called that, on the living room couch, the front door always unlocked, always waiting. The television was never on. The air inside was thick with stillness, the kind that collects in hospital rooms and empty nurseries. Oliver the cat curled at her feet now, eyes fixed on the door, as though he, too, were expecting something. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind a fog that clung to the ground like breath on glass. Morning light tried to break through, but only managed a dull gray. Then, scratching, soft, subtle, barely there. At first Grace thought it was the wind, or maybe Oliver pawing the rug. But then came another sound, a thud, low and hollow, as though something heavy had collapsed just outside. Grace sat up. Her body ached from the position she'd slept in, but her heart began to race. She crossed the room in 2 steps and reached for the door handle. Paused. Listened. Silence. Then one more faint scrape. She opened the door. At first she didn't see it. Just fog, curling across the yard, brushing against the porch steps. But then, emerging from that white veil like a ghost from the earth, a dog, a large German shepherd, matted fur covered in dirt and brambles, blood smeared across its left flank and hind leg. Its chest heaved with every breath, shallow and labored. One ear was torn. There was a deep gash along its back that looked fresh, jagged, and in its mouth, dangling from muddy, trembling jaws, was something small. Grace's heart stopped. A bracelet, tiny, handmade, plastic beads threaded together with uneven knots, and a charm shaped like a cloud. Lyra's bracelet, the one she wore every day, the one she made herself at preschool. "Oh, my God," Grace breathed. The dog locked eyes with her. Not feral, not wild, but pleading, intelligent, wounded, but not broken. Something passed between them in that moment, a current, an understanding. Then, without warning, his legs buckled. He collapsed onto the porch with a dull thud, the bracelet sliding from his mouth and landing at her feet. "No, no, 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 please." Grace dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out. Blood soaked into the wood beneath his body. His eyes fluttered, then shut. "Stay with me, please," she whispered, cradling his massive head in her lap. "You found her, didn't you? You found my baby." She lifted the bracelet with shaking fingers. It was dirty, but unmistakable. Still warm from where it had rested against the dog's tongue. Tears welled, but she held them back. She looked down at the shepherd's side, pressing gently near the worst wound. He flinched, but didn't growl, didn't bite, just endured. "Where did you come from?" she asked him softly. "How far did you run like this?" Footsteps behind her. Deputy Hughes appeared at the gate, his boots already splattered with mud. "Grace, I came by to—" He froze, took in the scene, the blood, the dog, the bracelet in her hand. "Jesus," he whispered. Grace looked up at him, her eyes wide and alive in a way he hadn't seen since the night Lyra disappeared. "She's alive," she said, her voice raw. "I know it now. This dog, he brought me her bracelet." Hughes approached slowly, crouched beside them. "That's a working dog. Look at the harness strap scar on his chest. Military? Police? He's trained." Grace nodded, eyes still on the shepherd. "He came back for a reason." They stared at the animal, both knowing this wasn't a coincidence, not a lost stray, not a pet that wandered off. A message. "Let's get him to the vet. Now," Hughes said, already on his radio. "I'll call Dr. Holloway. If we save him, maybe he'll show us the rest of the way." Grace didn't move at first. Her hand rested gently on the shepherd's neck. His heartbeat was faint, but there. "Hang on, boy," she whispered. "You didn't come all this way just to die here." The shepherd's ear twitched, barely, and for the first time in 3 days, hope thin, desperate but real, began to stir in her chest. Dr. Holloway had been a veterinarian in Maple Glen for over 20 years, and in all that time she had stitched up animals attacked by coyotes, pulled barbed wire from a horse's belly, and even treated a hawk with a bullet lodged in its wing. But nothing prepared her for the dog that Deputy Hughes carried through her clinic door that morning. "Set him here," she said quickly, motioning to the steel table in exam room 2. Her assistant, Mira, was already gloving up behind her. Grace hovered just beyond the threshold, still clutching Lyra's bracelet in her fist like a talisman. Her eyes were rimmed red but dry. She hadn't cried, not yet. She didn't want to blink and miss anything. The dog lay motionless, save for a faint tremor in his chest. His coat was soaked with half-dried blood and mud. Bruises beneath the fur hinted at trauma deeper than what showed on the surface. Multiple lacerations, back leg, flank, dorsal area. "Some of these are deep," Dr. Holloway muttered, already clipping fur around the wounds. "Older burns. And this?" She gently tilted the shepherd's body, revealing a scar that curved like a half-moon under the ribs. "Shrapnel, maybe. This isn't from falling down a ravine." Hughes folded his arms. "He was sent into hell and walked back out." "Didn't come alone," Grace said quietly. "He brought something back." Mira leaned in with a scanner. "Let me check his chip." She passed it over the shepherd's neck once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. "No ID?" Mira shook her head. "Something's wrong with the reader." Dr. Holloway frowned. "Try lower." Still nothing. "Wait." Mira moved to the opposite ear. "There's a brand, not ink, burned in." Everyone froze. The dog flinched as Mira gently parted the fur beneath the left ear. There, scabbed over and faint, was a tattoo. Black, angular, military style. One word: Echo. "Jesus," Hughes breathed. Dr. Holloway squinted. "That's not standard civilian canine. That's military classification. Experimental unit, maybe. Something covert." Grace stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached to touch the fur beside the name. The dog didn't react, didn't move, just stared ahead, his eyes fixed on something behind them or beyond them, something none of them could see. "I think he's trying to forget," she whispered. The room fell silent again. After 2 hours of stitching, flushing, and gentle sedatives, Dr. Holloway finally stepped back. The shepherd was still unconscious but stable. Bandages wrapped his hindquarters. His ribs rose and fell with shallow breaths, like waves in a storm that had begun to calm but not yet clear. "Give him time," she said. "If he lives, it'll be because he chose to." Later that evening, Grace returned to the clinic. The storm had rolled back in, soft thunder rumbling like a heartbeat underground. She entered the room quietly. Mira had left a lamp on low, casting a golden pool of light across the shepherd's body. He was awake now, barely. But he didn't bark, didn't lift his head. He just stared. Out the small clinic window where trees swayed in the dark, like he was waiting for something to emerge. Grace sat down beside him on the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I don't know what you've seen," she whispered, "but I think it's more than anyone ever should." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the bracelet again, set it on the edge of the table. "Her name is Lyra. She's 6. She talks too much when she's nervous, and she makes up songs about animals that aren't real. She puts marshmallows in her spaghetti, and she loves you. She must have. You came back for her." The dog's eyes didn't move, but his ear twitched. Grace sat in silence for a long time, just listening, watching the rise and fall of his breath, the soft tap of rain against the roof. "You're not just a dog," she said finally. "You're a witness." Behind her, a door creaked open. It was Deputy Hughes. "They ran the markings. Echo Unit was part of a now-defunct military K-9 program, he said. No public record, burned files, but someone higher up is already trying to shut us out. You know what that means. Grace turned. He wasn't supposed to come back. No, Hughes agreed. But he did. They both looked at the shepherd, still silent, still watching the trees. The vet clinic was quiet after dark, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of rain tapping the windows. Grace hadn't left Echo's side since sundown. She sat cross-legged beside his bed, her back leaning against the cabinet, Lyra's handmade bracelet still nestled in her palm, like a prayer she didn't know how to say aloud. Echo hadn't moved in hours, hadn't made a sound since the moment she found him. Until now. It started as a shift of weight, a twitch, then a low, breathy groan, something between pain and urgency. Grace opened her eyes. "Echo?" The German shepherd pushed himself up on trembling forelegs. His back legs shook under him but held. Bandages wrapped around his ribs strained with each breath. Blood had seeped faintly through the gauze, but it didn't stop him. He turned his head-locked eyes with her. Then he did something she hadn't seen before. He barked, once, low, broken, but clear. Then, without waiting, he limped to the small table where the bracelet had been placed. With delicate care, Echo picked it up in his mouth again, then turned to the door. "Echo, what are you doing?" Grace asked, standing now. He didn't look back. He nudged the door with his nose. It creaked open just an inch. Enough. And then he started walking, into the rain. Grace hesitated only a second before she threw on her coat and followed. "Echo, wait!" Headlights swept into the drive. Deputy Holden Hughes had just returned from a second round of interviews with townsfolk, pointless ones. He barely had time to park before he saw Grace running toward the trees. "What the hell, Grace?" "It's him," she shouted over her shoulder. "He's going somewhere. He's trying to show us." Holden grabbed a flashlight from his dash and followed her without another word. They crossed the parking lot in seconds, feet splashing through puddles. Echo was ahead of them now, moving faster than he should have been able to. His body was broken, but something deeper than muscle and bone was carrying him forward. Instinct. Memory. A tether only he could feel. The rain intensified as they reached the forest's edge. Grace slowed, instinctively reaching for Holden's arm. "He's leading us into the woods," she whispered. Holden panned his flashlight over the tree line. "This late, with what he's been through?" "He's not just a dog, Holden." They followed the trail Echo carved through the brush, his paws pressing into the mud, leaving staggered impressions behind. Trees loomed overhead like silent witnesses. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of wet leaves made Grace's heart thud louder in her ears. Holden walked just behind her, weapon holstered but hand near it. The flashlight beam danced ahead, casting shadows across Echo's soaked fur. "He shouldn't even be able to walk," Holden muttered. But Echo kept going. He moved with purpose, limping, yes, but undeterred. Every few yards he would stop, sniff, look back at them, then continue. It felt less like they were following him, and more like he had done this before. Grace felt it. Every step into the forest felt like stepping into someone else's memory. Echo's memory. The air changed, thicker, heavy, and somewhere deep in the trees, the silence wasn't natural. It was watching. They crossed a narrow creek, water licking at their ankles. Grace stumbled on a root, and Echo paused until she caught up. Holden pointed the flashlight higher. Ahead, something loomed in the darkness. A structure, barely visible under a curtain of vines and moss. It wasn't a cabin. Not really. It was a shell wooden walls, half-rotted beams, a porch collapsed inward, no light, no sound. Echo stopped at the foot of it. He dropped the bracelet and lay down, completely still. Holden took a slow step forward, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. "Is this it? Is this where—" Grace didn't let him finish. She was already climbing the porch. Her breath came in ragged pulls. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. She pushed it gently. It creaked open. Inside, the air was damp, rotting, but it was what she saw in the flashlight's beam that made her fall to her knees. A child's sock, a broken ceramic mug with a faded cartoon bear, and scrawled into the far wall in crayon, "I want to go home." Grace covered her mouth. "Lyra," she whispered. Holden stepped beside her, his voice low. "There's more." She followed the light with her eyes. Scratches in the floor, as if something or someone had been dragged. A torn-up mattress, duct tape, and blood, old, dried. A wave of nausea hit her, but behind the horror was something else. Proof. Echo had brought them here, to the truth. Back outside, the rain continued to fall. Grace stepped back out and knelt beside the dog. He was breathing hard now, chest heaving with exhaustion. His eyes blinked slowly, almost apologetically. "You did it," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "You brought her back to me." The rain had slowed to a misty drizzle by morning, but the trees were still weeping. Water clung to every leaf and branch, turning the forest into a cathedral of sighs. It was nearly dawn now, though the sky remained heavy, colorless, and silent. Echo was limping again, but he kept going, always forward. Each breath from the dog was a low rasp, each step a quiet act of defiance against whatever had tried to break him. His wet coat clung to his ribs, the bandages beneath soaked and darkening again. But his eyes, those deep, war-torn eyes, never lost their focus. Grace followed close behind, boots caked in mud, her fingers still wrapped around Lyra's bracelet, like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. Deputy Holden Hughes flanked her with the flashlight, jaw tight, every sense sharp. The trail was faint, nothing but crushed grass, bent ferns, and Echo's prints. But it was real, and he knew it by heart. They hiked for miles. Time unraveled into something else out there, in the dense woods of Maple Glen's forgotten corners. No road, no birdsong, only their footsteps, their breathing, and the quiet leadership of a broken creature that somehow knew more than any of them. It was Grace who first noticed it, just a flicker of shape through the trees. "There," she whispered, stopping dead. Holden raised the light. Nestled between gnarled oaks and shrouded in wild thorn bushes, a structure began to emerge. It wasn't a home anymore, if it ever had been. The farmhouse leaned like an old man near collapse, swallowed in ivy and moss. Shingles peeled from the roof like old bark. A porch sagged to one side, and vines coiled around the beams like they were holding the building down, like the forest itself wanted to bury it. But something was wrong with the silence. It wasn't total. It throbbed with something else. Echo stopped just beyond the porch steps. His entire body froze, not in fear, but in alertness. He dropped the bracelet again and pressed his ears forward. The fur on the back of his neck stood up. Grace stepped up beside him, heart pounding. "What is this place?" Holden scanned the structure. Wasn't on any of the maps. No recent property records, no trail leading here, almost like someone wanted it forgotten. Echo let out a low, guttural growl, and then Grace heard it. A sound, so faint it might have been the wind, but no wind whimpered like that. Her blood iced over. She stepped closer to the house, one foot on the first porch plank. It creaked under her weight. "There's someone inside," she said, barely above a breath. Holden moved in front of her, gun drawn now. He reached the door, tested the handle. It was locked, or rather, barricaded. Echo didn't wait. With a snarl, he hurled his injured body against the wood. Once, twice. The third hit splintered the doorframe just enough for Holden to shoulder through the rest. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. The air reeked of mold, metal, and decay. A beam of light from Holden's flashlight cut through the gloom-dust motes, swirling like ghosts, and then, from beneath the floorboards, they heard it again. A whimper, not animal, human. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Lyra?" She dropped to her knees and pressed her ear to the floor. The sound was clearer now, a child's sob muffled behind wooden boards and earth. "Oh, my God," she gasped. "She's here. She's underneath." Holden was already pulling aside a warped rug. Beneath it, a trap door, padlocked. Grace fumbled in panic, hands useless. Echo didn't hesitate. He sank his teeth into the rusted metal and pulled until it groaned, teeth scraping, blood seeping anew from his mouth. Holden struck the lock once, twice, with the butt of his flashlight, and it snapped. The trap door creaked open. The smell hit them first, then the cold. Stale, damp, but livable. Holden went down first, Echo right after. Grace followed, every bone in her body trembling. The narrow stairs led to a space barely tall enough to crouch in, a cellar of sorts. It was lined with old crates, a broken cot, and discarded wrappers, and in the far corner, curled into herself like something trying to disappear, was a girl, hair matted, skin pale, clothes torn, but alive. The flashlight's beam caught her face, and Grace dropped to her knees with a cry that came from some ancient place inside her. "Lyra!" The little girl blinked. At first, no recognition. Then, "Mama?" She launched herself into Grace's arms with a force only the lost could understand. Grace wept into her daughter's hair, rocking her as if to make up for the lost days. "I've got you. I've got you. I never stop looking, baby." Echo limped over, sat beside them. Lyra reached out a trembling hand and touched his head. You stayed with me." Grace looked up. "You knew, didn't you?" The dog said nothing, just leaned into the touch of the girl he'd saved. The trapdoor groaned as it swung open fully, revealing the yawning blackness beneath the farmhouse floor. The stench was immediate damp rot, and the bitter edge of rust, like forgotten rainwater pooled on metal. It wasn't just a basement. It was a place meant to keep things hidden. Holden's flashlight cut a narrow beam down the old wooden steps, each creaking rung a whisper of time past and horrors sealed. "Stay behind me," he said, voice low, eyes scanning. But Grace had already dropped to her knees at the opening, peering into the dark like a mother willing to crawl into hell itself if it meant finding her daughter. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the floor, trying to listen past the pounding of her own heart. Echo didn't wait. With a grunt of effort and a visible shudder through his battered frame, he descended first, claws clicking on the worn wood, then onto the dirt floor below. The light followed him, catching dust and mold, and there, a small figure, tucked into the farthest corner like she was part of the wall. A tangle of limbs, hair matted to her face, knees hugged to her chest, unmoving. Grace's soul left her body for a second. "Lyra?" she choked out. "Sweetheart?" She descended without waiting for permission, without waiting for breath. The moment her boots hit the floor, Echo stepped aside like he understood this wasn't his moment anymore. Grace dropped to her knees before the child. The air in the cellar was thick and unmoving, as if holding its breath. "Lyra, baby, it's me. Mommy's here. You're okay now." No response. Just the faint rise and fall of shallow breathing. Grace reached out hesitantly, like touching her might make her disappear. But when her fingers brushed against Lyra's shoulder, the little girl flinched so violently it shattered Grace's heart. Hey, it's okay. It's okay. It's over." Lyra's eyes opened slowly. They were wide, dull, clouded, and not focused on her mother. Not at first, but on Echo. He stepped forward, lowered his head, and something shifted. Lyra blinked twice, and then her tiny hands, scratched and shaking, reached out and clung to the dog like he was the last solid thing left in the world. She buried her face in his neck and began to cry. Not loudly, not like a child crying for toys or nightmares, but in a way that broke the air in two. Grace knelt there, stunned, arms still outstretched, watching her daughter sob into the fur of a dog she'd met only days ago. Her throat closed. "Echo," she whispered, as if saying his name could explain anything. Holden stood behind them, flashlight trembling in his grip. "She's alive," he breathed, half in awe. "God help me. She's alive." Grace leaned in, gently pressing her hand against Lyra's back. "I'm here now. You hear me? You're safe." But Lyra didn't answer, didn't even look at her. She just clung tighter to Echo, fists tangled in his fur, as though letting go would mean falling off the edge of the earth. The cellar felt smaller with each breath. Holden cleared a stack of overturned crates and found a lantern, ancient but still functional. With a flick and spark, it bathed the space in warm, uneven light. The details came into focus. A half-empty water bottle, some torn granola wrappers, a soiled blanket, scratches on the wooden beams like something or someone had been trying to claw out. Grace saw it all and wished she hadn't. "How long was she down here?" she whispered. Holden shook his head. "Hard to tell. But she was fed. Not well, but just enough." He didn't finish the sentence. The implication was enough. Grace felt the bile rise in her throat. "Someone did this to her." "Yeah," he said darkly. "And someone meant to come back." Echo's ears perked at that. His body tensed again, not like fear, more like recognition, like whatever darkness had nested here still lingered on the walls, and he could smell it. "We need to get her out of here," Grace said quickly, kneeling beside her daughter again. "Lyra, honey, can you stand? We're going home." But Lyra just pressed her face deeper into Echo's neck and whimpered, like the idea of leaving the cellar was worse than staying. "She's in shock," Holden said gently. "Might be for a while." Grace nodded, tears welling up again. Then Echo did something unexpected. He shifted his weight, adjusted so that Lyra was cradled between his front legs. He rested his head on her back, warm and steady, like he'd done this before, like he knew how to hold broken things. Grace reached forward again, this time slower. Her hand found Lyra's, and together they both stayed there in the stillness. A mother, a daughter, and a dog with eyes that had seen too much. After a moment, Lyra finally shifted, just enough to let Grace gather her into her arms, still clutching Echo with one tiny fist. She didn't speak, but her breathing slowed, and that was enough, for now. The farmhouse creaked like it was remembering. Deputy Holden stood alone now, flashlight slicing through the musty shadows, dust motes swirling in the beam like ghosts disturbed. Grace and Lyra had already left with Echo Grace cradling her daughter, Echo trailing just behind like a quiet sentinel. But Holden stayed behind, something gnawing at his gut, something colder than fear. There were stories this house hadn't told yet. He pushed open the last of the interior doors. A faded room, once yellowed with age but now grayed by time and moisture. Wallpaper curled at the edges like peeling skin. Every step stirred grit beneath his boots. Then he saw chains, broken ones, hanging from a steel eyelet embedded in the floor just beneath the windowsill. One end still latched, the other twisted and snapped like something strong had thrashed against it. A faint smear of something dark had dried into the floorboards nearby. Not fresh, but unmistakable. Blood. Holden knelt down, running gloved fingers over the grain. The smear trailed slightly like someone had been dragged. He exhaled, slow. This wasn't just a hiding place. It had been a prison. In the corner sat what remained of a rusted metal dog bowl, dented and kicked askew. Beside it, a wooden chair with one leg cracked and claw marks deep, frantic along the baseboards. Animal? Or something more? He turned toward the hall and followed it deeper into the rot and silence. Behind the last door he found what might have once been a utility room. Now it was filled with half-collapsed shelves, burlap sacks, and a smell like mildew and rusted iron. One shelf had fallen completely, spilling a dozen shattered objects across the floor, but something glinted beneath it. Holden knelt and reached through the debris. A camera, busted. Its lens was cracked, body warped from what looked like a brutal impact, but it was unmistakably a professional-grade field camera, the kind used for surveillance or documentation, the kind not just anyone had lying around. Its SD slot was empty. Whatever it recorded, someone had taken great care to erase. Holden turned it over. Burnt initials on the plastic grip. AG. He didn't recognize the name. But Echo might. Something shifted, then quiet, but present. Holden stood and caught sight of the doorframe. Gnawed, not chewed like a bored pet. These were deliberate, desperate. Marks, low and high, etched deep with the kind of strength and determination only panic can give a creature. A large jaw had done this, sharp teeth. He'd seen enough working dogs to know. And suddenly, the truth clicked into place with a sickening finality. Echo had been here, long before Lyra. Held, caged, maybe even tortured. And now, he'd led them back. Holden swallowed hard. The house wasn't just the scene of a kidnapping. It was the last chapter of something darker, something longer, something orchestrated. He scanned the wall again and saw something carved into the wood by the light switch. Not initials, numbers, 3914R military style. A code? A unit? Holden snapped a picture with his phone. He was about to leave when he noticed something tucked under a cabinet wedged behind a beam. He pried it out. A worn dog tag. Burnt around the edges, nearly unreadable, but not completely. Echo 3, MP Unit 17, property of... The last line had melted. The deputy stared at it, breath held in his lungs like a secret he wasn't ready to release. It wasn't just that Echo had escaped. It was that someone had owned him. not loved, not cared for, owned. And whoever they were, they hadn't wanted him found. Holden's hands shook as he slipped the tag into a plastic evidence bag. He rose to his feet and looked around the ruined farmhouse again. The broken chains, the dark stains, the claw marks that spelled out more than any confession ever could. Echo had survived this place, but he hadn't left it behind. And somehow, despite the scars, the burns, and the silence, he had come back for a little girl he didn't owe anything to. That kind of loyalty wasn't learned. It was forged. Through fire. Through fear. And through something darker than Holden could name. He flicked off his flashlight and stepped into the sunlit porch, the wind carrying dust behind him. Somewhere out there, the past was still alive. And someone was going to answer for it. 3 years earlier, classified location, northern borderlands. The world was silent just before it burned. Dust coiled in the desert wind as the convoy approached the compound, 3 black SUVs and a matte van crawling over the gravel like predators closing in. Inside the lead vehicle, the hum of radio chatter buzzed under clipped breathing. Maps, heat signatures, infrared surveillance, all green, target confirmed, children inside, traffickers armed. The team had trained for this, but no amount of planning could predict what waited inside. Sergeant Mason Thorne adjusted his earpiece and glanced down at the dog seated beside him, still as stone. A German shepherd coat, dark, eyes darker, but more aware than any soldier Thorne had ever fought beside. "Echo," Thorne murmured. "You with me?" The dog lifted his head, ears forward, silent, focused, ready. He always was. Echo wasn't just a K-9, he was the linchpin of Operation Blackout, a federal sting aimed at dismantling a cross-border trafficking network that had eluded capture for nearly a decade. The compound ahead was their hub, their vault, their graveyard, until tonight. "Go time in 60, came the voice over comms. Doors swung open. Men in tactical gear fanned out into the moonless dark, rifles tight to their shoulders. Echo moved like liquid shadow beside Thorne, no leash, no hesitation. The shepherd had memorized every scent on the briefing board, every blueprint, every telltale trace of fear and violence. It was wired into him now. At the breach point, Echo went first. A signal. Then silence. Then boom! The explosion ripped through the eastern wall without warning. The compound shuddered. Concrete belched fire and metal. Screams erupted, scattered by the force of chaos. Men were flung back like dolls. Thorne was thrown sideways, the impact cracking the world in half. Then blackness. Echo had just cleared the entry hall when it happened. One moment, the scent trail of narcotics and sweat was growing stronger, and the next, fire swallowed the roof. Beams collapsed. Smoke poured into the corridors like a living thing. Somewhere behind him, Thorne's voice vanished in a static burst. A slab of ceiling came down inches from Echo's spine. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He moved. Through fire. Through glass. Through corridors collapsing in waves. He found one of the storage rooms. The air was tight. His flank was bleeding. His right leg barely held weight. But somewhere in this furnace he could still smell it. Fear. Children's fear. He followed it, down into a locked corridor. He threw himself at the door again and again until the rusted latch cracked. Inside, 4 children huddled in the corner, eyes wide with disbelief as the beast entered from the fire. He didn't growl. He lay down. The smallest child, a boy no older than 6, reached a trembling hand to Echo's shoulder. and Echo stayed still until the boy curled against his chest and cried. When rescue teams returned the next morning, they found the children safe. But Echo was gone. The official report listed him as KIA killed in action. No body recovered. Sergeant Thorne protested. He wouldn't run, he wouldn't leave. They told him the roof caved in, no dog could have made it out. But Echo had. He'd clawed his way through ash and metal and into a world that would never call him by name again. He had no handler now, no mission, no chip that could be traced, only the pain and the memory of children screaming, of fire licking at fur, of betrayal, not by Thorne, but by whatever force had triggered the blast. It wasn't random. It wasn't collateral. It had been timed. Too perfect. As if someone wanted to wipe the whole slate clean. And Echo, loyal to the last breath, became a ghost in the system. Unaccounted for. Unclaimed. Unforgiven. Some nights in the shadows beyond the border towns, locals would whisper about a black dog that watched without blinking. That followed the scent of blood like a curse, that never barked, never begged, but always arrived when evil stirred. They didn't know his name, but in one basement, in one locked farmhouse, someone did. They carved it in code. Echo 3. Because even ghosts leave footprints, and some wounds bite back. Present day. The abandoned farmhouse, deep woods of Maple Glen. The farmhouse had stopped groaning. The wind had moved on, but inside, the air still trembled. Deputy Holden stood by the busted cellar door, arms crossed over a Kevlar vest still streaked with dried mud. The crime scene unit moved in measured silence behind him, suits white, gloves blue, boots shuffling carefully across floors that whispered of rot and memory. They hadn't seen a place like this before, at least not in Maple Glen. Grace sat on the front porch steps, Lyra curled beside her like a leaf refusing to fall. Echo lay just a breath away from the child's bare feet, ribs rising slow, eyelids half closed. His coat had been cleaned, wounds dressed, but nothing about him looked healed. Holden stepped away from the doorway as a forensic tech approached. "We got preliminary DNA," she said. "From the basement. Wood fibers, dried fluids. It's bad." "How bad?" The tech hesitated. "We've got matches in the missing persons database, at least 3 girls, one from upstate, one from Vermont, one flagged in a federal cold case file from nearly 4 years ago." Holden stared at her, jaw clenched. "Same M.O.? "Same everything. Isolation, soundproofing, chained containment. Chemical traces suggest sedation agents, but—" She glanced back at the barn. "The dog hair, that's what's odd. We pulled Echo's fur from the old splinters in the lower door frame. That dog didn't just show up last night." Holden looked toward Echo now, watching the woods again, still and heavy like a stone remembering its weight. The deputy's voice dropped. "How long?" "Based on decay, minimum 8 months, but the claw marks—" Her throat tightened. "It's like he never left, or came back." Inside the house, more layers were peeling loose. A busted camera, burnt memory card, chains bolted into the concrete support beams. One plank gnawed through until the grain turned bloody. A rusted food dish in the corner with bite marks, canine, deep ones. Echo had been held here. Echo had escaped here. And then he came back. Holden knelt beside a stack of dust-covered ledgers. His glove caught something wedged between 2 pages, paper brittle from time, but not lost. Dates, initials, weights, ages. "Jesus," he muttered. "This isn't just a random act. This place was a station, a waypoint. One tech across the room confirmed the theory. We found tire impressions leading through the East Trail. Faint, old, like someone used this road but didn't want it found. Grace didn't ask what they meant. She didn't need to. Her world now revolved around a heartbeat wrapped in her arms and a dog who never left her daughter's side. Lyra hadn't spoken a word since the rescue. But that morning she'd handed Echo a piece of bread. It crumbled in her hand as if she'd forgotten what to do with it. But Echo hadn't moved. He'd only blinked once, slow, then turned his head and growled toward the tree line. 2 hours later, Agent Dana Mallory arrived from the Department of Homeland Security's Missing Persons Task Force. The local sheriff's office deferred quickly once they saw the case tags. Echo's burned-out chip, the farmhouse's GPS blind zone, the coded initials. All of it pointed to something bigger. Mallory reviewed the DNA matches, the scars on the dog's flank, the precise evidence logs recovered by Holden's team. She walked over to where Echo was lying and crouched low. "Echo," she whispered, not expecting anything in return. But his eyes flicked toward her, just once. Mallory studied the tattoo under his ear, faded, half-charred, but still legible. Echo 3. "You were declared KIA in 2021, she murmured. His eyes didn't leave hers. "You were trained to track traffickers," she said. "They thought you died in that blast. But you didn't, did you?" She lowered her voice further. "You kept going." She stood, turned toward Holden. "Your dog isn't just a victim. He's a witness." "No," Grace said from the porch, her voice trembling. "He's a survivor, and he came back for her." Hours later, the sun dipped behind the hills. The techs began packing their kits. But Mallory stayed. She pulled a map from her satchel, one with red pins peppered across 6 states. At the center Maple Glen. She drew a circle, then narrowed her eyes at 3 of the older pins. "You think he was tracking them?" Holden asked. "No." Mallory's voice was colder than dusk. "I think they were using him. Then he turned." "Turned?" "Some of these trafficking rings, they train dogs for containment, tracking, intimidation. But if a dog breaks programming, especially one bred like Echo, they lose control. It's happened before." One of our cases in 2018, codename Lazarus, was an escaped military dog that brought down half a cartel. Holden's voice dropped. "And you're telling me Echo is what? Rogue?" "No." Mallory looked toward the dog, now asleep beside Lyra again. "I'm saying he became what they never could train him not to be. A wolf who never stopped tracking." The room smelled like paper and crayons, and the faint sweetness of lavender diffusers trying too hard. Outside the window, summer clung to the branches, but inside, time moved differently. Slower, gentler. Lyra sat at the little round table, her legs swinging above the polished floor. A stack of colored pencils sat untouched beside her elbow. Across from her, Dr. Molina, heart-child trauma specialist, soft-voiced, eyes like moss weighted with the patience of someone who'd listened to silence for most of her career. Grace watched through the two-way mirror, arms crossed, fingers white-knuckled against her own elbows. Echo sat beside Lyra's chair like a statue carved from shadow and loyalty. One ear twitched every now and then, catching nothing and everything. "She won't talk," Grace murmured. "She doesn't need to," said Holden from behind her. "She's alive. That's enough." But Grace shook her head. "No, it's not." In the room, Lyra finally reached for a pencil. Not black, not red, a pale slate blue soft like rain clouds. She began to draw. No words, just lines. Straight, hard, then jagged. Hart didn't interrupt. She only watched, her notebook untouched, her presence a question mark written in silence. The drawing took shape slowly. A square, bars. A smaller circle inside curled like a sleeping animal. Then came the figure, tall, thin, no face, but a dark outline, almost a shadow in a suit. When Lyra finished, she looked up, not at Hart, but at Echo, and he stood. Not all the way. His weight still shifted off his wounded side, but he moved closer, nose brushed against her knee. Hart's breath caught. She leaned forward carefully. "Lyra," she said, voice like a lullaby someone left behind. "Can you tell me who that is?" No answer. Just wide eyes, hazel, drowned in too many things no child should ever carry. "Is he the one who took you?" Still no words, but Lyra's head dipped, barely, a ghost of a nod. Then she pressed the picture to Echo's chest, as if to say, "You already know." Later that night, Grace sat with Holden at the station, the picture between them under a pale desk lamp. The lines were simple, but they said too much. "You think she saw the trafficker?" Holden asked. "She drew the trafficker," Grace replied. Her voice wasn't angry. It was something colder, sharper. "She doesn't remember a name. She doesn't need to. Echo does." Holden rubbed a hand through his hair. "We still have no ID on the man. That sketch could be anyone. A nightmare, a symbol." Grace's eyes narrowed. "No, it's him. The tall man in the suit, the cage. Lyra saw him. Echo fought him. And I don't believe in coincidences anymore." She opened the evidence folder they'd been building, scattered photographs, timelines, maps. And there, at the edge of one photograph from the compound raid 3 years ago, a blurred figure, almost an afterthought. Black suit, no tactical vest, holding a briefcase, not a weapon. Grace pointed at it. "There." Holden squinted. "Could be a liaison, or someone outside the chain. Or someone above it," she said. She pushed the photo toward him. "Echo didn't just survive. He was chasing something, someone. He came back here because Lyra's abduction wasn't random, it's connected. To the compound? To them, whoever ran it." Holden looked away. "If what you're saying is true, then this goes way beyond Maple Glen." "Then we dig deeper," Grace said, voice low. "We follow Echo." Meanwhile, Echo lay on the floor of Grace's guest room, where Lyra now slept. The girl hadn't let anyone else near her that evening, not even Grace. She'd curled up beside Echo, one hand tangled in the thick fur around his neck. And when she twitched in sleep, Echo didn't move. He only opened his eyes, watched the shadows, listened to the wind. He knew something else was coming, not just from the woods, but from the past, because Lyra wasn't the only one who remembered the man in the suit. Somewhere in his scarred mind, in that primal place beyond commands and training, Echo had seen that figure too, behind glass, beyond fire, before the cage door ever opened. The rain returned that morning, soft, steady, and oddly warm, like the sky had run out of fury but not grief. Inside the precinct, Grace stood over the whiteboard, hands on her hips, staring at a name that now burned through the center of everything. Elliot Crane, philanthropist, entrepreneur, founder of the Crane Initiative for Displaced Youth. Holden set down the coffee he hadn't touched. public face of angelic intervention, donor to 3 orphanages, 2 child wellness centers, and the arts program at Redwood Middle School. Grace didn't look away from the board. And somehow connected to 5 children who vanished in the last 8 years, all under different jurisdictions, all from foster placements. Holden opened a folder. You'll love this. One of the search and rescue dogs listed in a prior case. 2019. Idaho signaled on a remote cabin 3 miles from a Crane property. The lead went cold. Nothing admissible. Let me guess, Grace said, her voice flat. He was out of the country. Per his official passport record, yes. Africa. Charity conference in Ghana. Grace spun around. But we both know you can't interrogate a man who hides behind smiling foundations and third-party board members. Holden nodded grimly. The guy's Teflon. His papers check out. Tax filings clean. Public persona unshakable. He's on half the town's Christmas card list. Grace walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and pulled up an archived interview. There he was. Elliot Crane, sharp suit, soft voice, that curated warmth of a man who knew how to own a room without seeming like he needed to. We believe every child deserves a voice, he said to the camera, especially the ones the world forgets. That's who we protect. Grace paused the video. Funny, she muttered, that he uses the word protect like it's a shield instead of a cage. Later that afternoon, Deputy Reyes brought in a file from the county archives. This just hit from the background request on Crane's early years. Grace opened it. Before the suits, before the foundations. Elliot Crane had once been a junior researcher at Project Lantern, a defunct federal program that worked on enhanced behavioral response in trauma-adjacent youth. The documents were redacted, pages blacked out like ink-slashed riddles. But Grace found what she needed. One memo, half erased, marked Subject 6C, Adaptive Companion Behavior, Failover Response, Retention Test, Handler, Crane, E-Facility, Undisclosed, Likely Site Bravo, MN. Jesus, she whispered. He wasn't a donor. He was a handler. Holden looked up. Of what? Grace didn't answer at first. She opened the drawer and pulled out Lyra's drawing again. The tall man, the cage. She turned it over. On the back, Lyra had drawn something new that morning. A building, long, low, with no windows, a wire fence around it, and next to it, scribbled in gray, stood Echo, a younger version, leaner, not yet scarred, not yet broken, staring out while others, smaller shadows, stood behind bars. You think Echo came from this Lantern program? Holden asked. I think Crane used it to engineer obedience, Grace said. And when it failed or someone fought back, they buried the evidence in charity and smokescreens. She stepped back. Lyra was never just a victim of chance. Crane was hunting survivors. That night, Grace typed a report. She stopped halfway through. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, because it no longer felt like a police case. It felt like a war someone had quietly been fighting for years, and Echo had been fighting it alone. Until now. The vet clinic was quiet, save for the low hum of the sterilizer and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Echo lay on the steel table, sedated but breathing steady. His fur had been clipped back along the spine and hind legs, revealing a patchwork of scars, old burns, shrapnel wounds, and faint surgical lines. Dr. Natalie Cheng stood beside Grace and Deputy Holden, her gloved fingers carefully holding a slender object beneath the overhead light. It was buried deep, she said quietly. Almost missed it on the scan, between his scapula, aligned just off the main nerve cluster. She set the object on the metal tray with a soft clink. A microchip. Not the standard ID kind, not the grain-of-rice veterinary implant every shelter used. This one was longer, thinner, coated in black resin, and etched with something no civilian chip should ever have. Series M77L, Protocol, Blacklight. Holden leaned in. That's not registered in any civilian database? Chung shook her head. It pinged one frequency for half a second, before going dark. Military-grade encryption. Whoever built this didn't want it traceable through conventional means. Grace narrowed her eyes. But you pulled movement data. Only partial. The chip was designed to transmit bursts, not stream continuously. But we got fragments, locations, and timestamps, enough to establish patterns. She tapped her keyboard, and a map blinked to life on the screen. Red dots lit up across a 3-year span. Montana, Oregon, Northern California. Always remote, always brief. But one spot flared again and again, a tight cluster of pings just outside of Crane's mountain property, about 5 miles east of his main estate. Grace's breath hitched. Holden frowned. What's out there? Natalie zoomed in. The satellite image is outdated, lots of tree cover, but terrain files show a depression near the ridge, old landslide zone. Hard to access. Grace stared at the screen. Not if you're trained to move unseen. She looked down at Echo's still body. You didn't just run, you doubled back. Hours later, back at the station, Grace reviewed the logs again. She traced each return Echo had made to that zone near Crane's estate. They weren't random. The intervals formed a pattern like a patrol. Holden joined her, holding a folder. Military liaison called back. That chip Blacklight series was part of an R&D contract from 2012. Experimental behavioral pairing. Most of the records are sealed, but one name came up on procurement. He opened the file. Elliot Crane, civilian contractor. Security clearance, level 4B. Assignment, behavioral response. Canine unit. Retired. Grace's voice turned to steel. So he didn't just handle the kids. He handled the dogs, too. Holden nodded. It gets worse. He was pulled from the program after a failed field test classified incident overseas. No disciplinary record, just vanished from federal service and showed up 2 years later with a nonprofit smile. Grace looked back at the screen, at the path Echo had carved over months, maybe years. He remembered. Not just where, but who. That's why he kept returning. Holden added. And why he stayed close to Lyra. She's not just another rescue. She's part of what was taken. Grace didn't speak for a long moment. Then, quietly, Echo wasn't lost. He was on a mission. Back at the clinic, Echo stirred from sedation. He didn't whine, didn't move much, but his eyes opened and locked on Grace the moment she stepped in. Still alert, still waiting. She knelt beside the table, gently laying a hand on his chest. I know what they did to you, she whispered. And I know you didn't stop fighting. Echo blinked once, then slowly, painfully lifted his paw and placed it on her arm. A silent confirmation. A vow. Grace looked at him, her voice barely more than a breath. We're not done yet. The fluorescent lights in the district attorney's office buzzed with a dull monotony. The air was too cold, the chairs too stiff, and the walls too clean to feel like anything human ever happened there. Grace sat at the edge of her seat, still in her field jacket, her boots caked in dried mud and forest debris. She hadn't even gone home. Not since Echo led them into that nightmare. She couldn't. Not while that man's name was still on a plaque downtown. Across from her, D.A. Leonard Briggs flipped through a folder that had been sitting unopened since she walked in. He looked like a man who'd built a career never losing a case and never sticking his neck out to do it. "I read the report," he said finally, his voice low, diplomatic. "You've done good work, Grace. I mean that. You found a child alive. You uncovered a location possibly used for trafficking. I'm grateful. But," her voice was flat. Briggs sighed and folded his hands. "But what you're giving me is a dog's movement pattern, a damaged microchip we can't authenticate, and a little girl too traumatized to testify. No forensic evidence tying Crane directly to the farmhouse. No prints, no DNA, nothing actionable." Grace leaned forward. Her jaw clenched. "What about the property lines? The pings from the chip near his mountain house? The fact that Echo kept going back there?" "That's not coincidence, Leonard." Briggs didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just gave her the look that said, "We can't go to court with this. We can't win with this. And I can't risk my name for this." He said instead, "It's circumstantial. You know it is. And worse, your lead witness is a dog." He almost winced at the word as he said it, as if he knew how ridiculous it sounded, as if that made it easier. Grace stood slowly, not in rage, but in something quieter, heavier. "I've been in law enforcement 12 years, Leonard. I've seen child cases go cold because of circumstantial. I've seen bruises dismissed as accidents and abusers walk because the victims were too scared to speak." He opened his mouth, but she cut him off, calm, controlled, but laced with fire. "That dog led us through 20 miles of dark forest with a shattered leg to a cellar no one would have ever found. That dog stayed behind when the system failed. That dog kept hunting while the rest of us moved on." Her voice broke, but she didn't. "That dog saved my daughter when your system couldn't even find her." Briggs shifted, uncomfortable. Grace's hand dropped to her side. Fingertips grazed the worn leather of Echo's collar, which she hadn't let go of since they left the vet clinic. "I don't need him to testify, Leonard. I just need you not to look away." Silence filled the room. Then Briggs spoke, measured. "Do you have anything else? Anything I can use to get a warrant?" Grace stared at him. "I have a girl who draws cages in her sleep. I have a house full of blood Echo's tasted before. I have a chip that shouldn't exist and a pattern of missing kids that all stop within 50 miles of Elliot Crane's name." Briggs closed the folder, tapped a pen against it. "None of that gets past a defense attorney." Grace's expression hardened. "Then I hope your conscience sleeps better than Lyra does." She turned to leave. Before she reached the door, Briggs said, "Grace." She stopped, barely glancing back. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying bring me something they can't bury with legalese." She didn't answer, because right now, words meant nothing. But she knew a dog who didn't need words to hunt monsters. They hadn't meant for it to go public. At first, it was just Grace standing in front of a podium outside the sheriff's office, her voice firm but tired, flanked by grainy photos of Echo 1 taken the night he limped out of the woods, another from his days in a canine vest before the fire took his unit and left him presumed dead. Behind her were whiteboards, hand-drawn maps, a timeline of disappearances, and one name in red, Elliot Crane. "And while our legal options are limited," she told the cluster of reporters, "I believe the people have a right to know the truth. Echo's body tells a story our system refuses to hear." Cameras clicked. A few mumbled questions were thrown out, but she didn't stop. She gestured to the screen where a scan showed layers of scar tissue across Echo's ribs, the twisted metal of the hidden chip, the burns that matched the arson report from the compound 3 years prior. Every wound lines up with trauma at the farmhouse. Every ping from his chip matches travel routes to Crane's private estate in Blackbriar Ridge. He didn't stumble onto that property. He returned to it. She paused, scanning the silent crowd. Echo is not just a survivor. He's a witness. The story exploded in a matter of days. #EchoKnows began trending within hours of the first local report. By evening, national outlets picked it up. Hero dog returns from the dead to expose child trafficking. The media ran wild with it, some respectful, others sensational, but none could ignore the quiet fury beneath Grace's words, or the footage of Echo still limping, still silent sitting beside the drawing Lyra had made. The cage, the man in the dark suit, the man Echo wouldn't stop tracking. Journalists began knocking on Crane's foundation door. At first, his PR team dismissed the accusations as absurd, manipulative, based on the ramblings of traumatized parties and one emotionally unstable dog. That last part didn't sit well with the public, especially when footage surfaced of Echo pulling a child's shoe from a dried creek bed near Crane's property line. Grace hadn't released it. It was leaked. But the image of Echo dropping the mud-caked shoe at her feet, then turning back to the trees with that same haunted stare, spread like wildfire. Echo wasn't unstable. He was unrelenting. In the sheriff's office, Deputy Holden scrolled through comments on the department's official statement. Most were supportive. Some were venomous. Dogs can't testify. She's using the animal to distract from her failed parenting. Another circus trial built on emotion, not evidence. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. Grace stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes fixed on a photo of the farmhouse taped to the wall. "You okay with this getting messy?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Echo's been hunted, burned, and forgotten," she said. But he kept going, because something inside him refused to let this die. She turned to Holden. "Yeah, I'm okay with messy." That week, Grace filed an official motion with the court to have Echo recognized as a living forensic element, not just a piece of evidence, but an active link in the chain of events. She argued his trauma map, the placement of old wounds, his behavior patterns, even his stress responses, was more consistent than most human testimony. The hearing was denied, then appealed, then denied again. But something had shifted. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, holding signs, "Believe the dog. Echo saw what they won't say. If he could speak, you'd listen." More than a protest, it felt like a reckoning, for all the children who were never found, for all the monsters hidden behind polished charities and perfect smiles, for all the times the system asked for more when it already had enough. Echo had no voice, so Grace gave him hers. In a quiet moment, away from the headlines and hearings, she knelt beside him at the station. His ribs were still healing, his left paw stiff with nerve damage. But when she rested her hand on his neck, he leaned into her like a ghost learning how to come back to life. "You're not evidence," she whispered. "You're the damn trail." He closed his eyes, and in that stillness, that unspoken knowing, Grace understood something that no jury ever would. Echo didn't need justice for himself. He'd already survived hell. He wanted it for the ones who never made it out. The farmhouse had been cleared days ago, Yellow tape sagged along the porch, flapping in the dry wind like something forgotten by the world. Most officers had moved on, forensics logged and boxed, but Deputy Holden had a feeling that gnawed at his gut like unfinished business. Something was still here. He stepped into the ruins of the cellar. Dust thickened in the air as his boots crunched on broken tiles. The smell of mildew clung to the walls, and every surface was stained with the weight of silence. He swept his flashlight low. That's when he saw it, half tucked beneath a floorboard that had warped in the recent rain. A sliver of canvas, fabric too new for a place so old. He crouched, pried the board loose. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sheet, was a notebook small, weather-worn, with cracked red binding and metal spirals warped by time. It wasn't labeled, no names on the front, just a single word scribbled faintly on the inside cover. Sanctioned. Holden's fingers went cold. Back at the station, he spread the notebook out beneath a desk lamp. The pages were coded rows of initials, dates, coordinates, sometimes just numbers, grouped and spaced in even columns. It could have been nothing, or everything. But on page 17, he found it. Echo 3. The name was written in a careful hand, circled in red ink. Beneath it, blackout site, recovered, sentience confirmed. Holden stared at the words, his mouth dry. He flipped backward, skimming other names. Kane 1, Raven 2, Enyx 4, all followed by shorthand status updates. Neutralized, non-compliant, asset lost. It wasn't just Echo. There were others. Grace leaned over the desk, knuckles pale, eyes locked on the notebook like it might whisper something she already suspected. Echo wasn't an accident, she said. He was part of something larger, a program. Holden nodded slowly. They numbered them, he said. Like inventory, not K9's assets. The air felt heavy. She flipped to Echo 3 again. What does sentience confirmed mean? Holden hesitated. They weren't just trained. They were monitored, evaluated for independence, awareness. Grace blinked, then looked over at Echo sleeping nearby on a padded mat, one ear twitching at the sound of her voice. He wasn't just surviving, she whispered. He was remembering. That night, Holden couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the notebook open beside a half-empty coffee mug. Rain tapped against the window like cautious fingers. His mind kept circling one question. Why Echo? Why did he survive? Why did he find his way back when the others, Kane, Raven, Nix, were marked as lost? His hands trembled as he flipped again to the entry on Echo 3. There was one more note, barely legible in the corner. Subject, exhibited return behavior. Pattern, obsessive, uncontrolled but targeted. He swallowed hard. Echo wasn't following orders, he was following memory. The next morning, Holden visited the shelter where Echo had first been dropped off years ago, emaciated and covered in soot. He asked for the intake form. They handed him a yellowed folder, nearly discarded during digital transfer. Inside, stapled to the first page, was a sticky note. No collar, no chip. Holden stared at it, then slowly pulled out his phone and brought up the recent scan that revealed the military-grade chip hidden under Echo's scarred flank. Someone had cut it out before he was found, or tried to. The only reason they even detected the chip was because Echo had shifted during surgery, and the scanner passed over the edge of the metal. Whoever left him there had wanted him to disappear, but Echo never stopped returning. Back at the precinct, Grace stood before the old whiteboard again. This time she didn't just write Echo, she added Echo 3, Survivor Kane 1. Presumed dead? Others? The list of initials burned into her skull. The idea that there could be more like him, trained, used, discarded, made her stomach churn. Were they out there, broken and buried, or worse still, under control? Echo stirred by her feet, then slowly walked up beside her. His head leaned into her thigh, the way he always did when her thoughts spun too loud. She looked down. He wasn't just a dog. He was a witness to a graveyard of secrets no one wanted unearthed, and the only one still walking. The television flickered softly in the corner of the hospital room. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the blinds, striping the pale walls in gold. The volume was low, but the anchors' voices carried just enough to fill the silence between heartbeats. Breaking story, as state officials confirmed that 12 children were rescued from an undisclosed compound near the Highlands. Lyra sat curled on the couch beside Grace, knees drawn to her chest, a blanket tucked under her chin. She hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the night she'd been found, not since Echo had pulled her from that cellar and laid his body between hers and the dark. Grace didn't pressure her. No one did. The therapist said trust would come in fragments. Words would return in whispers when they were ready, not before. But today felt different. Echo rested on the floor near her feet, tail thumping softly against the tiles every few minutes, as if to remind her, "I'm here, still here." The news report cut to footage blurred to protect identities of small figures being led out of the compound. One child limped, another held a stuffed bear so tight the fabric tore at the seams. A boy in a green shirt handed bottled water to a girl too young to ask for it. And then something happened. Lyra leaned forward. Grace felt it before she saw it. Lyra's body tensed, not in fear, in recognition. The child's small hand lifted, and her finger pointed deliberate, unwavering toward the screen. "That's him," she said. Grace froze. Lyra's voice was rough with disuse, like gravel rolling across frost. But it was her voice. "He was nice," Lyra whispered again. "He gave me water." Echo's ears perked up, then flattened slowly against his head. He stood and moved beside Lyra, pressing his forehead gently into her side. Grace could feel tears springing to her eyes before she could stop them. She knelt beside the girl. "Lyra," she said softly, "can you tell me more about him?" Lyra's face scrunched, trying to remember. You could almost hear the effort it took to push words through the fear that still lived in her chest, like a shadow. "He said we'd get out," Lyra murmured. "He said he remembered birthdays, but I didn't know what that was." Her voice cracked. I didn't have one." That night Grace sat alone on the porch, hands trembling around a mug of tea long gone cold. The memory of Lyra's voice echoed louder than the crickets. I didn't have one. What kind of world was this, where a child didn't even know the day she was born? Grace thought of the other kids rescued, yes, but broken in ways no medicine could mend. They had numbers instead of names, barcodes instead of birthdays, property, ghosts. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her notes. She typed one line. Children without birthdays. It wasn't just a phrase. It was the headline, the battle cry. The following morning, A team of volunteers arrived at the temporary shelter housing the rescued children. Grace was there with Echo, at the request of one of the therapists. "He calms them," the woman had said. "He doesn't even need to do anything. Just be. Grace watched as Echo moved through the group, slowly, gently allowing hands to reach for him when they were ready. Some kids cried, some didn't know how, but when Echo sat beside them, it was like time paused. Pain waited. And for a moment, they remembered what safety felt like. Later that day, Lyra drew again. This time, it wasn't a cage. It was a birthday cake, lopsided and scribbled in green crayon. 7 candles flickered above it. She pointed to one of the figures beside the cake. "That's Echo," she said proudly. "He gets a cake, too." The therapist nodded, eyes welling. And just like that, the girl who once didn't know how to ask for water was imagining a party for a dog who had never left her side. It didn't happen in the therapy room. It happened in the hallway sunlit linoleum, quiet and warm. Lyra sat cross-legged, one hand curled against Echo's chest, feeling his heartbeat. She wasn't speaking to anyone else, but today she was humming. Echo stilled, his ears tilted, his tail swept the floor once. "He used to hum that," Lyra whispered. "Who?" Grace asked softly. Lyra's voice shook. "The nice boy, the one who gave me water." "Do you remember his name?" She shook her head. "They weren't allowed. They'd get hurt. I didn't talk then. It was safer not to." Grace crouched beside them. "But you're talking now." Lyra nodded. "Because he's here." She meant Echo. That night, Grace met with Dr. Kalin, the child psychologist. Files were open, but at the center sat a photo Lyra gripping Echo's collar like a lifeline. "She doesn't trust adults," Kalin said. "Can you blame her?" Grace replied. "But she trusts him. He's not just a support dog. He senses things, anticipates." "You're saying he's a therapist?" "I'm saying he's doing what most therapists can't." Echo had scars, a torn ear, a limp, but it was what wasn't visible that made him different. He didn't force connection. He waited, still, listening. And every time Lyra broke the silence, Echo never looked surprised. In the days that followed, Lyra whispered fragment stories half buried in fear. The lights buzzed, loud, like bees. There was a ladder. We couldn't climb it. Each time, Echo was near, never demanding, just present. One morning she refused to eat in the cafeteria. Too loud, too much. Therapists tried coaxing her. She didn't move, but when Echo entered, she stood and followed. A child burned by betrayal, and a dog who never asked her to speak. That night, Grace sat beside Echo by the window. "You're more than a K9, aren't you?" He didn't move. "You're what they couldn't control." His tail tapped once. "You're the reason she's still here." Later, Crane appeared on television, calm, rehearsed, sitting beneath the logo of his foundation. "I've devoted my life to protecting vulnerable children," he said. "These accusations are fueled by grief, by confusion." Echo lifted his head the moment Crane spoke. Then a growl, low, then louder. He lunged at the TV, snarling, hackles raised. The table shook, glass rattled. Lyra screamed. "Turn it off!" she cried, hands over her ears. "Turn it off!" Grace scrambled for the remote. The screen went black. Lyra curled on the floor. "He lied. He knows me. He knows." Grace dropped beside her. "What do you remember?" Lyra whispered. "He came to the house. Not always, but when he did, the others got quiet." Echo curled beside her, pressing into her back. "He wore gloves," Lyra added. "Even when it was hot. He didn't hurt me, but he watched. Said it was for science, for choosing the strongest." Echo rested his paw over her foot. Then she said it. "He called me Subject 12. That night no one slept. Lyra clung to Echo. Grace poured untouched coffee down the sink. Her hands shook. Crane hadn't revealed himself to the cameras, but to the girl who couldn't forget. At sunrise, Holden arrived. "He didn't just react," Grace said. "He exploded." Holden nodded. "We need more than instinct." Lyra remembered. She said Subject 12. He wore gloves. He watched. Holden's face paled. "She's the 12th. How many more?" Echo stood by the window, gaze fixed, waiting. They found it in the pines outside Telleridge. No address, no records. A forestry drone had picked up heat. Now officers surrounded the building. Silent, grim. No furniture, no beds, just cages, rows of them, some barely large enough for toddlers. The metal was scarred, clawed. In a corner, alphabet blocks. A child's shoe. Grace couldn't breathe. Holden emerged from a back room, holding a black box. "Tape drives. We're bringing in cybercrime." Echo stood on the porch, trembling. He wouldn't enter. "There's a cellar," a deputy said. Grace followed them down. The stairs creaked. The air grew heavier. A single bulb swung overhead. The walls were padded with acoustic foam. At the end, a camera, a chair, and a switchboard. "Don't watch them," Holden told the tech officer. "Just log and seal." Grace clenched her fists so tightly they bled. She didn't speak, but something inside her cracked. The footage wasn't shown, but the stills leaked. A child's drawing of a cage and a man with no face. A nameplate. Property of CED Foundation. R&D access only. And a photo. A girl's hand reaching through bars toward a black German shepherd. The caption, "Echo 3, we see you now." At home, Lyra sat beside Echo on the couch. Her hand rested on his back. Grace knelt beside her. "People are asking questions now." Lyra looked up. "They didn't look before, even when we screamed. We're looking now, and we're not stopping. Don't let them forget. We won't." The next day, the news dropped the word alleged. They named names, asked how a registered non-profit bought property with no inspections, how children vanished through a system with no records. Lyra asked Echo, "How many of us?" Echo licked her hand. Grace watched from the hallway. She'd stopped protecting Lyra from the truth, because the truth was the only way through. 200 miles away in a snow-buried cabin, Elliot Crane watched the report. He didn't blink, didn't speak. Behind him, a man emerged from the shadows. "They found Site 3, he said. Crane exhaled, not surprised. "Begin cleanup," he replied. "Phase 2 starts now." The courtroom was so quiet, Grace could hear the ticking of her own heartbeat. She took the stand like someone walking into a storm she'd already survived. Echo sat at her feet, calm, watchful. He didn't need to make a sound. Everyone remembered how he'd found Lyra, how he'd refused to leave the porch of that house filled with cages, how he growled the moment Crane's voice played through the TV. The prosecutor approached. "State your name." "Grace Alder, Mother of Lyra Alder. Occupation? I was a pediatric ER nurse. I'm on leave. Why? Because my daughter was abducted. She was handed a bracelet cloth woven with a heart and dog paw, found near Crane's property beside a military-grade tracker embedded in Echo's neck. This belonged to your daughter? Yes. The prosecutor stated that the chip held logs tied to 3 off-grid properties owned by Crane. Crane's lawyer objected. The judge sustained but noted it. Grace spoke of the sleepless nights, the disbelief from authorities, the moment Lyra whispered her first words in months. He was nice. He gave me water. Do you believe your daughter would be alive if Echo hadn't found her? The prosecutor asked. No, Grace said, because no one else was looking in the right place. No one else believed what a child's silence meant. He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't assigned. He chose to go. He saved her when no one else could. She turned to the jury. I was told there wasn't enough evidence, that my daughter was probably a runaway, that I was emotional, that Echo's behavior was inconclusive. You want to know what trauma is? It's your daughter sleeping on concrete while a dog kept her alive. She leaned in. And it's sitting here today, staring at the man who put her there, knowing he still thinks he's untouchable. Echo stirred, turned toward Crane. A low sound rumbled, not a bark, not a growl, a warning. Crane shifted. Recess, the judge announced. Outside, Grace sat on the courthouse steps. Her hands trembled. Echo sat beside her, unmoving. I don't know how this ends, she whispered. Echo pressed his head against her shoulder, and for the first time in months, she let herself hope. When the courtroom reopened, Lyra entered. She looked smaller than the photos paler, but walking on her own. Grace walked behind her, not guiding. Not today. Echo walked at Lyra's side. When she sat, he lay at her feet, still as stone. The prosecutor crouched to her level. Do you remember the dog? Echo, Lyra whispered. He's been with you ever since? Lyra nodded. He stayed when I couldn't talk. Can you tell us anything about the place you were kept? The house had music, Lyra said. But not from people. From behind the piano. There was a room. The wall looked like books, but it opened if he pulled the red one. That's where the cage was. Cage? Big enough for me and 2 others. Do you remember the man? He had eyes like ice, she said, but not cold, just empty. What did he call you? Lark. And what did he call himself? Only on the phone. He said, tell them Crane already has his batch. Gasps. The judge called for quiet. There was a boy, Lyra added. Older. He gave me water. He didn't speak English. I think he was sick. I don't know if he made it out. You've been brave, Lyra, the prosecutor said. I want to be, Lyra whispered. I want people to know it was real, even if no one else saw it. The defense attorney stood, awkward. No questions. Because what argument do you make against a child's truth? Echo lifted his head as the man returned to his seat. Then Lyra looked at the jury. I didn't think anyone would ever believe me, she said. But Echo did. He never looked away. The courtroom shifted. It wasn't just about proving what had happened. It became about proving we had ignored it. 5 hours passed. Reporters waited outside like wind whispering guilt. Grace sat motionless. Echo never moved, still as when he first found the bracelet beneath the rot and snow. When court resumed, the jury filed in. Worn, older than when it began. The 4-person stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Edwin Crane, guilty on all counts. No cheer, no sigh of relief, just silence. Because how do you cheer for justice that comes too late for some? Grace closed her eyes, not from triumph, from restraint. Echo was watching her, not wagging, just holding her gaze. It's done. The bailiff gripped Crane's arm. He didn't resist, but before leaving, he turned to the gallery and smiled. That same rehearsed smile. Echo growled. Quiet, but enough for those near him to feel it through the floor. Crane was led out. Gone. The judge read closing instructions. The jury left, some wiping tears, some not looking back. Grace stayed seated as reporters swarmed. Do you think justice was served? Will you push for further investigation? What about the other children? But Grace didn't answer. She watched Echo ears forward, body still. Then he turned back toward the doors and sat again. Not because it was over, because Lyra was safe. Outside, the sun was setting. Long shadows fell across the courthouse steps where survivors stood quietly with photos and each other. No microphones, no noise, because grief doesn't leave with sound. That night, Grace stood in the backyard beneath the old oak tree. She held the verdict sheet in one hand. Echo lay a few feet away, tracking stars like they held names he hadn't learned yet. Grace whispered, not to herself, not to God. We did it. Echo stood, padded over, and leaned against her leg. And for the first time since the trial began, Grace cried. Not from being broken, but because the weight finally had somewhere to go. Into the earth, into Echo, into silence that meant peace. The trial was over, but for Echo, the war hadn't ended. He paced at night, not frantic, just looping, yard to door to window, window to Lyra's room. He wouldn't sleep unless he saw her. Not heard saw. One night Grace found him outside Lyra's door, one paw hovering above the floor, ears twitching at sounds only he heard. When a car backfired 3 blocks away, Echo dropped low to the ground, shaking. Grace stayed with him for over an hour, her hand on his side, whispering his name. But Echo didn't move until Lyra opened the door. Echo, she whispered. Only then did he rise, padding to her and resting his head against her chest like a soldier reporting home. The next morning, Grace sat at the kitchen table, coffee cold, reading articles she never imagined she'd search. Canine PTSD is real. Working dogs don't retire. They carry their wars with them. She glanced at Echo under the table, eyes open, body alert. Sleep something he no longer trusted. She whispered, You're not just a hero, are you? You're also broken. That evening, Lyra came home quiet. No drawings, just silence. She went upstairs without a word. After a few minutes, Echo began pacing. Then he climbed the stairs and sat silently outside her door. Minutes later, it opened. Can he sleep in my room? Lyra asked. That night, Echo didn't pace. He lay beside her bed, and when her hand dropped off the mattress, he shifted just enough to press his nose into her palm, like a prayer. In the days after, Grace began journaling, not for Lyra, for Echo, his triggers, his good days, foods he tolerated, toys he didn't flinch at. She called ex-handlers and military trainers. Each time she said Echo, the other end of the line paused. One man said, Echoes don't fade, they just get quieter, if you're lucky. Then one night Grace found an old article buried deep in a contractor archive. It referenced a canine unit. Echo 1 through Echo 4 were believed lost during Project Locust. 4? She stared at the sentence until the screen blurred. Had he been part of something deeper? Something that explained the way he scanned rooms, even ones he'd been in before? She didn't know, but she knew Echo carried scars not from wire or fire, but from memory, and memory didn't fade. One morning, Lyra placed her old T-shirt in his bed. Echo sniffed it once, then curled around it like a nest. Grace watched. They were healing each in their own time. Then the envelope arrived. No return address. Just a military-style postmark and Grace's name typed cleanly. Inside was a photo and a letter. The photo. A woman in uniform, dusty and tired. Beside her, a younger Echo scar above his eye, posture sharp, gaze locked forward. The letter. To whom it may concern. I'm Sergeant Lena Voss. Echo was my partner, my shadow, my reason for walking into hell and walking back out. 3 years ago, during Operation Blackout, we were ambushed. He pushed me behind a wall before the second blast. They told me he was KIA. I believed them. Until last week, when I saw the trial. The girl, the dog. It was him. I don't know how he got from Afghanistan to your courtroom, but I know this: he saved my life. And now he's saving hers. Please tell him. I never forgot. And if he remembers me, tell him he was never just a dog. He was my hope, my peace. Lena Grace's hands trembled. The photo slipped to the table. Outside, Echo lay curled in the sun, for once truly resting. She took a photo, his paw twitching in sleep, and emailed it to the return address. Subject: he remembers. Then she stepped onto the porch, knelt beside Echo, and whispered, She thought you were gone. Echo lifted his head, ears forward. She never stopped thinking about you. He blinked slowly, then shifted closer, resting his chin on her knee. And in his eyes something moved, something ancient. Recognition. That night, Grace read the letter again beside Lyra. She was his person? Lyra asked. Grace nodded. Lyra traced the photo. He was smaller back then. No, Grace said. The world was just bigger. The letter now rests in a box beneath Lyra's bed, next to her drawings, the bracelet, and Echo's old collar tag. A quiet sanctuary. The knock came soft, reverent. Grace opened the door before the second knock. It was her. Lena. Shorter than Grace imagined. Streaks of gray in her hair. Civilian clothes, but posture of someone who knew how to walk through fire. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Echo stepped forward, not bounding, just steady. He stopped at the edge of the porch, tilted his head, the same way he had in the photo. Lena gasped, hand to her mouth, the other reaching low handler's posture. Echo took 3 steps, then 4, and rested his head on her thigh. Lena dropped to her knees, arms wrapped around him, forehead pressed to his head. You found your way home, didn't you? Echo didn't bark, didn't move. He just stood there, eyes closed, like his bones remembered. Later, over tea they didn't drink, Lena whispered, I had his name tattooed on my shoulder after the war, thought it was all I had left. Grace smiled. Turns out he had more chapters. Lena chuckled. He always ran off script. They talked for an hour. About desert dust, dented ammo boxes, that one game with balled-up socks. Echo had always slept behind Lena's cot facing the door. He hated fireworks, loved ice cream, saved her life once in a collapsing shack. "He never asked me to be anyone but myself," Lena said. Grace nodded. "He's still that." Lyra approached, holding Echo's paw. "You were his first?" she asked. Lena smiled. "I was." Lyra nodded. "I'm his now." Their eyes met, not in rivalry but reverence, two souls sharing one bond. Echo lay between them, tail thumping once, as if to say, "You both carry me now." That evening Lena sat with Echo on the porch. The sunset turned gold and quiet. "Remember the river?" she whispered. "Where you almost chased that goat?" Echo's ear twitched. "The medic gave you ice cream after your paw got torn up." His tail flicked, he remembered, even if only in pieces. When Lena rose to leave, Echo walked her to the car. Each step slow, each look meaningful. She leaned down, pressed her forehead to his. "Keep her safe," she whispered. He blinked. She knew he would. Always. The papers were simple. A name typed in black ink, an address, a signature line. But the weight of them felt centuries old. Grace hesitated before signing, not from doubt, but reverence. Her hand hovered for just a second longer than necessary, as if acknowledging what those lines truly meant. Not ownership, not possession, but belonging. Echo lay at her feet in the courthouse office, tail curled neatly to the side. He didn't know he was being adopted, not in the legal sense, but in every way that mattered, he already had been. She signed. And just like that, the Monroe family grew by one former war dog with a limp and eyes that had seen too much. The sun was warm when they stepped outside. Lyra held the folder with the official seal, grinning like she'd just been handed the moon. "Is he really ours now?" she asked, looking up at her mother. Grace smiled. "He always was." Lyra dropped to her knees on the courthouse steps, wrapping her arms around Echo's neck. He accepted the embrace with that same stillness that made people believe he could read souls. "We're your forever people now," she whispered into his fur. Echo gave one soft huff of breath through his nose and leaned into her. That evening, while Lyra napped, curled beside Echo on the rug, Grace climbed the attic stairs and returned with a small box labeled "Unreturned." Inside were the fragments of the last 2 years, some broken, some beautiful. She picked up the bracelet first. Faded pink, worn threads, the tiny glass beads spelling out Lyra, now cloudy with time and soil. They'd found it during the first week of the investigation, tucked behind a floorboard in Crane's House of Horrors. It had been the first sign her daughter was still alive. Next came the dog tag. Echo 3, KIA, Operation Blackout. The letters were scratched, but legible. A piece of metal that had survived more than one kind of war. Grace brought them downstairs and placed them side by side on the kitchen table. For a moment she just stared at them. 2 objects from 2 lost souls who found their way home. She framed them together in a shadow box. No words, no caption. Just the bracelet and the tag, held by soft velvet, frozen in time. She hung it by the door, not as a warning, but as a promise. The past didn't disappear. Grace still woke up some nights in cold sweats. Lyra still checked windows twice before sleeping. Echo still scanned rooms before settling down, body tense until he heard each breath of the house settle into rhythm. But there was peace now. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of meaning. Echo had stopped pacing at night. As long as he could see the hallway to Lyra's room, he could rest. Sometimes Grace would find him there at sunrise, lying with his head pointed toward her door like a silent sentry. And Lyra had begun to laugh again. Not all the time, and not the kind of laugh that forgot the past, but the kind that remembered it and kept going anyway. One afternoon, Grace found Lyra painting Echo's portrait in watercolors. The proportions were all wrong, his ears far too big, his paws impossibly wide, but the expression was perfect, strong, gentle, awake. "He's not missing any more," Lyra said without looking up. "We found him." Grace sat down beside her, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. "I think maybe he found us." Lyra dipped her brush in sky blue and whispered, "Or maybe we were all missing, and now we're not." Echo lay a few feet away, tail slowly wagging. He didn't need to understand words to feel their weight. Home had a smell. It had a sound. And this time, it wasn't the clink of a leash or the ring of a command. It was the hush of quiet healing, the brushstroke of a child's hand, the framed proof that some things, no matter how broken, can be made whole again. The chairs were arranged in straight lines beneath the faded mural of Granite Hollow's founders. The air inside the town hall smelled faintly of lemon polish and old stone-like history trying to make itself presentable. A velvet box rested on a walnut podium. Inside, a silver medal in the shape of a shield, etched with two simple words: service, loyalty. The mayor stood nervously by the microphone, fingers fidgeting with the edge of his speech. Cameras blinked. Reporters whispered. There was a hush before the page turned in the town's story. And then the doors opened. Grace entered first. Not in heels, not in anything dramatic, just a navy blouse and worn jeans, the same clothes she wore the day Echo saved her daughter. That felt right. Lyra followed, holding Echo's leash loosely, though he hardly needed it. He walked with a steady limp, eyes alert, body quiet. He wasn't there for applause. He never had been. The crowd rose. Echo didn't. He simply walked beside Lyra, as if the rows of standing strangers were nothing more than trees in a forest he already knew how to navigate. The mayor cleared his throat. "We gather today not only to recognize courage," he began, "but to bear witness to the kind of loyalty that doesn't wear a uniform but bears scars just the same." His voice trembled on certain words, not because he was unsure, but because he was overwhelmed. "Echo," he said, turning toward the German shepherd, "is not just a dog. He is a survivor, a rescuer, and a reminder that even in our darkest hour, something waits with teeth bared not in rage, but in protection." The room held its breath. The medal was lifted from its box. Lyra crouched down. She didn't hang it from Echo's neck. She simply held it in front of him, open-palmed, as if offering a question. Echo sniffed it once, then did something that startled the entire room. He rested his head gently in her lap. No bark, no trick, just trust. Lyra smiled, not at the cameras or the officials, but down at the creature who had once pulled her from the silence of her cage and now chose her lap over the pedestal. "He doesn't need the medal," she whispered to no one in particular. Grace, standing off to the side, heard it anyway. "Neither did the heroes before him," she murmured. The ceremony ended without fanfare. No one clapped when they walked out, and strangely that felt perfect. Some stories don't need an encore. Some bravery doesn't need a headline. Some heroes wear fur and don't care who notices. Outside, a small group of children had gathered by the steps. One boy, no older than 8, hesitantly extended a drawing crayon lines forming a floppy-eared Echo with a heart around his head. Lyra accepted it. Echo didn't react, but his tail wagged once. Later that evening, Grace placed the medal in the shadow box beside the bracelet and the dog tag. No caption, just wait. The wind rolled gently through the tall grass, bending each blade just enough to catch the light. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Peace doesn't always come with fanfare. It arrives like this, soft, earned. Lyra ran barefoot through the field again. Her laughter, real, full-bellied, unafraid, bounced across the air like a song that had once been lost and now remembered the melody. She didn't look over her shoulder anymore. There were no more cages behind pianos, no more names whispered in therapy, no more nightmares bleeding through bedtime, just clouds that drifted like ships and the warmth of a sun she wasn't scared of. And on the porch, there he was, Echo, not standing, not guarding, just being. His front paws tucked neatly beneath him, chest rising slow and steady, ears twitching lazily toward her voice. One eye opened every so often, checking not with suspicion, but habit. The kind of instinct that doesn't retire, even when the war is long over. He wasn't chasing shadows anymore. Neither was she. Grace leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a coffee mug gone cold in her hand. She didn't speak, just watched. A year ago, her daughter couldn't even whisper. Now she was singing nonsense into the wind. She looked down at Echo. "You did that," she said quietly. He didn't respond. Of course not. He never had to. But maybe, just maybe, his tail thumped once against the wooden porch. Maybe that was his way of saying, "I know." Inside the house, on the mantel, the shadow box remained. 3 things. A child's bracelet, still stained faintly at the clasp. A dented military dog tag, scratched but intact. And the silver medal tucked gently behind them like punctuation. No plaque, no names. No explanation for visitors, just memory framed. As the sun dipped low and the sky blushed in soft purples and fading gold, Lyra collapsed onto the grass, arms outstretched like she could hold the entire horizon. Echo watched her for a long moment. Then, content, eyes half closed, he rested his head back on his paws. There are some heroes who don't wear capes, some who don't return to applause, some whose stories unfold in scars and silence and soft-footed loyalty. They do not ask to be remembered, but they are. And as the screen faded to black, a single line remained. Some heroes don't speak, they simply return. In a world that too often forgets the quiet heroes, stories like Echo's remind us of what truly matters: loyalty, resilience, and the healing power of unconditional love. Echo wasn't just a dog. He was a survivor, a protector, a silent witness to both pain and redemption. Through him, Lyra found her voice again. Grace found purpose. And we, as readers, are reminded that the bonds between humans and animals are not mere companionship. They are lifelines. German shepherds, with their unwavering devotion and deep intelligence, embody some of the best qualities we aspire to: courage, intuition, and heart. Echo's journey is a testament to the truth that even the broken can be whole again, and that sometimes salvation comes not in words, but in presence. Let this story echo beyond the page, a call to cherish, protect, and stand beside those who cannot speak, but who feel everything. For in every rescue, In every act of trust rebuilt, we're reminded of our shared humanity and the animals who make us better. May we love deeper, listen closer, and never take for granted the quiet ones who save us just by being there. Echo did not need a voice to be heard. Neither do the ones we hold dear.